In the summer of 1887, when the Montana Territory was still wild enough to swallow a man's dreams whole, a transaction took place that would reshape an entire valley. What started as a desperate father's bargain and a lonely widower's act of mercy would become the foundation of the largest cattle empire the Northwest had ever seen. But the girl at the center of it all, she couldn't speak a single word to tell anyone how it began. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust kicked up by Jeremiah Caldwell's wagon had been visible for miles across the open prairie, a brown plume against the endless blue sky that told anyone watching that desperation was coming to call. It was the kind of heat that made horses stumble and men question their sanity. But Jeremiah kept his team moving toward the weathered ranch house that sat like a lone sentinel against the rolling hills of Copper Creek Valley. Behind him in the wagon bed, wrapped in threadbare blankets despite the sweltering day, sat his daughter. Sarah Mae Caldwell had turned 19 just 2 months prior, though the hollow look in her dark eyes made her seem both younger and infinitely older. Her brown hair hung limp around shoulders that curved inward, as if she were trying to make herself smaller, invisible. She hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since the fever that took her voice and left her mother dead in the same week. The pregnancy showed now, a gentle curve beneath the faded calico dress that had once belonged to her mother. Jeremiah tried not to look at it, tried not to think about what it represented or how it had come to be. Some shame cut too deep for acknowledgement. At the reins, Jeremiah's weathered hands shook slightly. Not from age, he was only 42, but from the weight of what he was about to do. The drought had lasted 3 seasons. The creditors had taken everything: the farm, the livestock, even the few pieces of furniture that had made their house a home. All that remained was the wagon, 2 broken-down horses, and the burden of a daughter he could no longer provide for. The ranch house ahead grew larger as they approached. It was solid, built from local timber and stone, with a wide porch that spoke of better times. Smoke rose from the chimney despite the heat, and the corrals, though mostly empty, showed signs of recent repair. This was the home of Thomas Mitchell, a man Jeremiah had never met, but whose reputation preceded him like a shadow. Mitchell was a widower who had lost his wife and unborn child to childbirth 2 winters past. Word was he'd turned strange after that, keeping to himself, letting his once prosperous ranch dwindle to a fraction of what it had been. But he still had money enough to buy land when others were selling, enough to make the kind of deal that would solve Jeremiah's immediate problems while creating entirely new ones for his conscience. The wagon wheels crunched to a stop beside the porch. A dog barked somewhere behind the house, then fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was the creak of leather and the heavy breathing of the tired horses. Sarah Mae sat perfectly still, her hands folded over her growing belly, eyes fixed on something far beyond the horizon. The front door opened without ceremony. Thomas Mitchell stepped onto the porch, and even from 20 feet away, Jeremiah could see why the local women had stopped trying to court him after his wife's death. The man looked hollowed out, like a tree struck by lightning still standing, but with something essential burned away. His dark hair hung a little too long, his clothes were clean but ill-fitting, and his blue eyes held the kind of distance that came from spending too much time alone with grief. "You'd be Caldwell," Mitchell said. His voice carried clearly across the space between them, neither welcoming nor hostile. "Just factual, I am." Jeremiah climbed down from the wagon seat, his joints protesting. "Appreciate you agreeing to meet." Mitchell's gaze moved to Sarah Mae, still sitting motionless in the wagon bed. Something flickered across his features, not desire, not pity, but a kind of recognition that made Jeremiah's stomach tighten. "She's the girl?" "My daughter, yes." The words came out rougher than intended. "Sarah Mae, she's a good girl." Hardworking, just can't speak is all. Can't or won't. Jeremiah shifted his weight. Fever took her voice 3 years back. Same fever that took her mother. But she understands everything fine. Reads better than most men I know. Can cook, clean, mend anything you put in her hands. Mitchell descended the porch steps slowly, his boots making soft sounds against the packed earth. He moved to the side of the wagon and looked up at Sarah May. She met his gaze directly, without flinching, and Jeremiah felt a moment of fierce pride in her courage. How far along? Mitchell asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. Jeremiah cleared his throat. 4 months, maybe 5. Hard to say exactly. Father? Gone. Jeremiah's voice hardened. Drifter who promised marriage and disappeared when he got what he wanted. Sarah May's better off without him. Mitchell nodded slowly. He reached up and offered Sarah May his hand to help her down from the wagon. She hesitated for just a moment, then accepted, moving with the careful grace of someone accustomed to carrying precious cargo. On solid ground, she was smaller than she'd appeared in the wagon, barely reaching Mitchell's shoulder. But she stood straight, her chin lifted with a dignity that made Jeremiah's heart ache. She was so much like her mother in that moment, proud even in desperate circumstances. The terms we discussed, Mitchell said, turning back to Jeremiah. $500, that covers everything. Jeremiah nodded, though the word everything sat in his throat like a stone. They both knew what it meant. Not just Sarah May's immediate care, but a permanent arrangement. A transaction that would make her Mitchell's responsibility in every sense that mattered. She need to see a doctor regular like, Jeremiah said. For the baby, there's one in Millbrook, Dr. Harrison, good man. And after the child comes. Mitchell looked at Sarah May again. She was watching both men with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what was being negotiated, even if she couldn't voice any objection. That'll depend on what she wants, he said finally. It was the first indication that Mitchell might see Sarah May as more than just a burden being transferred from one man to another. Jeremiah felt something loosen in his chest, though he couldn't quite call it relief. The money changed hands without ceremony. $500 in gold and silver, enough to buy Jeremiah passage to California and a fresh start. Enough to let him disappear from Montana territory and the shame of what he'd done here. She's got a bag, Jeremiah said, climbing back into the wagon to retrieve a small canvas satchel. Her mother's Bible, a few dresses, some personal things. Mitchell took the bag and set it gently on the porch. Sarah May watched the transfer of her belongings with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout the entire proceedings. Jeremiah climbed back onto the wagon seat and took up the reins. His hands were steadier now, though his heart felt like it was tearing in half. Sarah May, he said, and she turned to look at him. For a moment, he thought he saw tears in her eyes, but her face remained composed. You're a good girl, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Your mama would be proud of how strong you've been. This is for the best, you'll see. She nodded once, a small, careful movement that somehow conveyed both forgiveness and goodbye. Mitchell stood beside her as the wagon pulled away, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Not possessive, not controlling, just present. It was more kindness than Jeremiah had dared hope for. The dust cloud from the departing wagon took nearly an hour to fully settle. When it did, Sarah May and Thomas Mitchell were still standing on the porch, two strangers bound by circumstance and a transaction that neither had asked for but both would have to live with. Are you hungry? Mitchell asked finally. Sarah May shook her head. Tired? This time she nodded. I'll show you to your room, he said. It was going to be a nursery. The 4. But it's got a good bed and a window that catches the morning light. He picked up her bag and opened the front door. Sarah May followed him inside, her hand trailing along the smooth wood of the doorframe. The interior was clean but sparse, like a house where someone had packed away everything that might hold memories. The room he showed her was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed covered in a quilt that looked handmade. A washstand stood in one corner, and the promised window looked out over the valley where the last light of day was painting the grass. "Gold. I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything," Mitchell said, setting her bag on the bed. "Though I suppose you can't call for me if you do." Sarah May turned to face him fully. She pointed to herself, then to him, then made a small knocking motion with her fist. The message was clear. She could knock if she needed him. Mitchell almost smiled. "Right, knock it is." After he left, Sarah May sat on the edge of the bed and opened her bag. Inside were the few treasures that represented her entire life. Her mother's Bible with pressed flowers between the pages, 2 dresses besides the one she wore, a small wooden comb, and a bundle of letters tied with ribbon correspondence her father had saved from the days when her mother was courting him. She held the letters for a long moment, remembering her mother's voice reading them aloud in the evenings before the fever came. Then she tucked them into the drawer of the washstand and began to unpack her new life, one small item at a time. Outside, night was falling over Copper Creek Valley. In the kitchen, Thomas Mitchell sat at a table built for 2 and ate a dinner meant for 1, occasionally glancing at the ceiling, where soft footsteps suggested his houseguest was settling in. Neither of them could have imagined that this awkward, painful beginning would become the foundation of something extraordinary. That the mute girl with her quiet dignity and the broken widower with his careful distance would build something together that would change not just their own lives, but the entire character of the territory around them. But that transformation would begin tomorrow. Tonight, there was only the settling of dust, the weight of new arrangements, and 2 people learning to exist in the same space while carrying their own separate burdens of loss and hope. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The rooster's crow that woke Sarah May on her first morning at the Mitchell Ranch was different from the one back home, deeper, more assertive, like it owned the world beyond the henhouse. She lay still for a moment, hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, letting the unfamiliar sounds of her new home settle around her. Cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of windmill blades turning in the morning breeze, boots moving across wooden floors somewhere in the house. When she finally rose and looked out her window, the view took her breath away. The Caldwell farm had been small, hemmed in by neighbors and debt. But here, the land stretched out like an ocean of grass, rolling hills that seemed to go on forever under a sky so vast it made her feel both insignificant and somehow larger than herself. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She smoothed her dress and opened it to find Thomas Mitchell holding a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of biscuits. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, offering both. His hair was damp from washing, and he'd changed into a clean work shirt. "Doctor's coming by this morning. Want to make sure everything's, well, that you're healthy." Sarah May accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic. She pointed to the window, then spread her arms wide, a question in her eyes. "The land?" Mitchell understood immediately. 3,000 acres. "Used to be more, but I sold off some sections after my wife died. Didn't seem to need so much space for just one person." She sipped the coffee stronger than what her father made, but good, and watched his face. There was pain there when he mentioned his wife, but also something else. A kind of wonder, as if he were seeing his own property through her eyes for the first time in years. "I'll show you around later," he said, "if you're feeling up to it." Sarah May nodded enthusiastically, then hesitated. She set down the coffee cup and moved her hands in a series of gestures, pointing to herself, then to various parts of the room. then making sweeping motions that seemed to encompass the whole house. Mitchell watched intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You're asking what you should do, how you can help?" Another nod. "Well," he said slowly, "I've been managing on my own for 2 years. House is clean enough, I suppose, and I can cook simple things. But it's been a long time since this place felt like a home instead of just a place to sleep." Sarah May picked up her bag from the bed and began rummaging through it. She pulled out a small leather journal and a pencil stub, opened to a fresh page, and began to write. Her handwriting was careful, precise. The letters formed with the attention of someone who had learned that written words were her only voice. She handed the journal to Mitchell. In neat script, she had written, "I can cook, clean, mend clothes, tend garden, want to earn my keep. What needs doing most?" Mitchell stared at the page for a long moment. When he looked up, something had shifted in his expression. "You don't need to earn anything," he said quietly. "I made an agreement with your father. Your keep is part of that." Sarah May shook her head firmly and took the journal back. She wrote quickly and showed him the page again. "Have pride. Must. Contribute. Please." The simple dignity of it hit Mitchell like a physical blow. He'd expected. Well, he wasn't sure what he'd expected. Gratitude, perhaps. Compliance. Instead, he was faced with a young woman who insisted on maintaining her self-respect even in circumstances that would have crushed most people. "The garden's been neglected," he admitted. "And the house could use a woman's touch, if you're sure you want to take that on." Her smile was the first one he'd seen from her, small but genuine. She wrote in the journal again, "Thank you. Will start today." Dr. Harrison arrived an hour later, a thin man with gentle hands and kind eyes who had been delivering babies in the territory for nearly 20 years. He examined Sarah May with professional courtesy, asking questions that Mitchell translated into writing when necessary. "She's healthy," the doctor pronounced afterward, washing his hands in the basin Mitchell provided. "Baby's positioned well, heartbeat strong. I'd say she's closer to 5 months along, which means we're looking at a birth sometime in late January or early February." "Winter," Mitchell said grimly. "Winter births are common enough," Dr. Harrison assured him. "Just means we need to be prepared. I'll want to see her monthly until December, then more frequently as we get closer. And Thomas." He paused, studying Mitchell's face. "This arrangement you've made. It's unconventional, but I've seen stranger things work out. Just remember, she's not livestock you've purchased. She's a person with feelings and needs." After the doctor left, Mitchell found Sarah May in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, attacking the accumulated grime on the windows with fierce determination. She'd already swept the floors and organized the few dishes in the cupboards. The space looked brighter somehow, more alive. He watched her work for a few minutes, noting the efficiency of her movements, the way she paused occasionally to rest her hand on her belly. When she noticed him standing there, she smiled and gestured toward the window she'd just cleaned. "Makes a difference," he agreed. "Haven't seen it that clear in months." She wiped her hands on her apron. When had she found an apron? And picked up her journal. "House needs woman's care," she wrote. "Been lonely too long." The observation was so perceptive, it made Mitchell's chest tighten. He'd thought he'd been managing fine, but looking around with Sarah May there, he could see how the house had gradually been drained of warmth and life. It was clean but sterile, functional but not welcoming. "My wife, Catherine," he said suddenly. She had plans for this place. Wanted to expand the kitchen, add a proper sitting room. Said a home should grow with the family that lived in it. Sarah May wrote quickly, "What stopped the plans?" Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. "She died before we could start. After that, it seemed pointless to build for a family I'd never have." Sarah May studied what she'd written, then tore the page from the journal and started over. When she handed it to him, the message was simple. Maybe time to build again. Different. Family, same home. The words hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross so soon. Mitchell felt something stirring in his chest, not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The idea that perhaps the transaction with Jeremiah Caldwell might become something more than just a business arrangement. "I should show you the rest of the property," he said, deflecting from the emotional weight of the moment. "If you're going to live here, you should know what you're part of." They spent the afternoon walking the closer sections of the ranch. Mitchell pointed out the various outbuildings, the barn that housed his remaining livestock, the chicken coop that provided fresh eggs, the smokehouse where meat was preserved for winter. Sarah May took it all in with wide eyes, occasionally stopping to examine something more closely or to rest when the walking became too much. At the far edge of the home pasture, they stopped beside a small fenced area that clearly hadn't been used in some time. The posts were still solid, but the gate hung askew and weeds had grown up through the rails. "Catherine's garden," Mitchell explained. "She had plans for vegetables, herbs, maybe some flowers. Never got the chance to plant." Sarah May walked to the gate and tested its hinges. With a little work, it would swing true again. She turned to Mitchell and wrote in her journal, "Could restore it. Plant for next spring. It's a lot of work," he warned. "Soil needs to be turned, fence repaired, and with the baby coming." She wrote again, "Have time before baby, need project." Like idea of growing things. There was something in her expression that made Mitchell nod slowly. "If you want to try, I'll help with the heavy work, turning soil, fixing the fence." As they walked back toward the house, Sarah May suddenly stopped and grabbed Mitchell's arm. She pointed toward the pasture where a small herd of cattle grazed peacefully. Even from a distance, it was clear the herd was smaller than the pasture could support. She wrote quickly, "Few cattle for so much land." "Why?" Mitchell followed her gaze. "Sold most of them after Catherine died. Didn't see the point in building a herd for just myself. Kept enough to get by, but nothing more. Could build again," she wrote. "Land good for many cattle. Takes money to buy stock," Mitchell said. "And time to breed them up. It's a long-term investment." Sarah May studied the pasture for a long moment, then wrote something that surprised him. "Have time now. Have reason to think ahead." That evening, as Sarah May prepared supper from the sparse supplies in Mitchell's pantry, he found himself really looking at his property for the first time in 2 years. She was right, he had far more land than he was using, and the grass was rich enough to support a much larger herd. Before Catherine's death, he had plans to expand, to build one of the largest ranches in the territory. Those dreams had died with his wife, but watching Sarah May move around his kitchen with quiet efficiency, he felt the first stirrings of ambition returning. Not for himself alone, but for the strange little family that was forming under his roof. Sarah May served supper without fanfare, simple beef stew and cornbread, but prepared with care. They ate in companionable silence, Sarah May occasionally writing questions about the ranch's operations, Mitchell answering thoughtfully. As the evening light faded, Sarah May stood to clear the dishes. Mitchell caught her hand gently. "Sarah May," he said, "about what your father, about the arrangement we made. I want you to know, if you ever want to leave, if you find someone else or just want to go your own way after the baby comes, I won't hold you to anything. You're not trapped here." She looked at him for a long moment, then picked up her journal. What she wrote made his breath catch. "First time in years anyone asked what I wanted. Maybe time to find out what that is." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the grass and carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Neither Sarah May nor Thomas Mitchell could have imagined that within 5 years, their small ranch would grow into an empire that stretched across 3 counties. But the seeds of that empire were already being planted in restored gardens, in plans for expanding herds, and in the quiet understanding growing between two wounded people who had found something worth building together. The news of Thomas Mitchell's acquisition spread through Millbrook like wildfire through dry grass. In a territory where a man's business was usually his own, the sight of Jeremiah Caldwell's wagon leaving the Mitchell ranch without his daughter was too scandalous to ignore. By the time Sarah May had been at the ranch for a week, every tongue in town was wagging with speculation, judgment, and barely concealed outrage. Martha Henley, the baker's wife and unofficial keeper of the town's moral compass, was the first to voice what others only whispered. She stood behind the counter of Henley's bakery, flour dusting her apron and righteous indignation coloring her cheeks, holding court with the three other women who had come for their weekly bread. "It's nothing short of white slavery," Martha declared, slamming a loaf down with unnecessary force. "That poor girl, traded like a head of cattle to a man twice her age. And her expecting too. It's an abomination before God." Eleanor Fitzgerald, the banker's wife, leaned closer conspiratorially. "I heard from Mrs. Patterson that the girl can't even speak. How's she supposed to call for help if that Mitchell fellow turns violent? Men get strange ideas when they've been alone too long," added Rebecca Walsh, whose husband ran the general store. "Thomas Mitchell's been peculiar since his wife died. This just proves he's lost his Christian mind entirely." The fourth woman, young Mary Catherine Bell, shifted uncomfortably. At 19, she was closer to Sarah May's age than the others, and something about their casual cruelty made her stomach turn. "Maybe we don't know the whole story," she said quietly. "Maybe he's trying to help her." Martha's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Help? Child, no decent man helps a fallen woman by moving her into his house. Mark my words, that girl will be ruined completely before the year's out, and that baby will be born into sin twice over." What the women of Millbrook didn't know was that Thomas Mitchell had anticipated their reaction. He'd lived in the territory long enough to understand how quickly gossip could destroy a reputation, and how that destruction would inevitably splash onto Sarah May. That's why, on Sarah May's 8th day at the ranch, he made a decision that surprised even himself. "We're going to town," he announced over breakfast, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. Sarah May looked up from her eggs, eyebrows raised in question. She reached for her journal, always within arm's reach now, and wrote, "Both of us, both of us," Mitchell confirmed. "People are talking. Best to let them see you're here by choice, not force." She wrote quickly, "We'll make things harder for you. Town won't approve." Mitchell studied her serious expression, noting the way she instinctively tried to protect him from consequences that should have been his to bear. "Sarah May, I stopped caring what this town approved of the day they crossed the street to avoid. Looking at my grief. If they want to judge us, they can do it to our faces." An hour later, Mitchell's wagon rolled down Millbrook's Main Street, with Sarah May sitting beside him on the bench seat. She wore her best dress, a deep blue calico that brought out her eyes, and had braided her hair in a neat crown around her head. Her pregnancy was more obvious now, but she carried herself with quiet dignity, back straight and chin up. The reaction was immediate and electric. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Women pulled their children closer. Men removed their hats not in greeting, but to get a better look at the spectacle. By the time Mitchell tied his horses outside Walsh's general store, a small crowd had gathered across the street, pretending to be engaged in other business while straining to watch every move. "Stay close," Mitchell murmured as he helped Sarah May down from the wagon. "Don't let them intimidate you." Inside the store, Rebecca Walsh's demeanor was coldly polite. She served them efficiently, but without warmth, her eyes constantly flicking to Sarah May's midsection with barely concealed disapproval. When Sarah May pointed to a bolt of yellow fabric and wrote a question about price in her journal, Rebecca's lips pursed as if she'd tasted something sour. "That's fine cotton," Rebecca said curtly. "Expensive for everyday wear. Sarah May wrote in her journal and showed it to Mitchell. For baby clothes. Want to make them myself. The simple declaration hung in the air like a challenge. Here was a young woman, pregnant and mute, planning for her child's future with the practical determination of any expectant mother. It was harder to paint her as a victim when she was clearly making her own choices. Mitchell purchased the fabric along with thread, needles, and several other household supplies. As Rebecca tallied the purchases, her husband Robert emerged from the back room. He was a heavy-set man with thinning hair and the soft hands of someone who'd never worked harder than lifting boxes. "Thomas," Robert said with forced joviality, "heard you had a visitor staying out at your place." "Not a visitor," Mitchell replied evenly. "Miss Caldwell is living at the ranch permanently." The correction was deliberate, and its implications weren't lost on Robert. His eyes sharpened. Living there? In what capacity exactly? Sarah May stepped forward before Mitchell could answer. She took her journal and wrote something, then handed it to Robert. Her handwriting was clear and bold, as his partner. "We're building something together." The word partner sent ripples through the store. It was ambiguous enough to mean anything. Business partner, life partner, something in between. But it established Sarah May as an active participant rather than a passive victim. And that changed everything. Robert cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, that's unconventional." "So was settling this territory," Mitchell said, gathering his purchases. "Unconventional doesn't mean wrong." As they left the store, Martha Henley intercepted them on the sidewalk. Her face was flushed with the fervor of someone who believed God had appointed her to correct other people's moral failings. "Thomas Mitchell," she said in a voice loud enough to carry across the street, "I feel compelled to speak as a Christian woman about the scandal you're creating." Mitchell's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Sarah May stepped forward. She pulled out her journal and wrote something quickly, then held it up for Martha to read. "Judge not, lest ye be judged." Matthew 7:1, the biblical quote, written in Sarah May's careful script, hit Martha like a slap. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly as she struggled to find a response that wouldn't make her seem like exactly the kind of judgmental hypocrite the verse warned against. "Well," Martha finally sputtered. "I never," Sarah May wrote again, this time showing the page to the growing crowd. "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." Matthew 5-7. A murmur went through the onlookers. Whatever they had expected from the poor mute girl, it wasn't this quiet but firm defense of her choices using their own scriptures. Sarah May had turned their righteous indignation back on them with the skill of someone who had spent years listening to sermons and actually absorbing their meaning. Dr. Harrison appeared at the edge of the crowd, having heard the commotion from his office across the street. "Is there a problem here?" he asked mildly, though his presence carried the weight of professional authority. "No problem, Doctor," Mitchell said. "We were just leaving." But Dr. Harrison's eyes were on Sarah May, noting the color in her cheeks and the protective way she held herself. "Miss Caldwell, how are you feeling? Any concerns I should know about?" Sarah May shook her head and smiled, writing quickly, "Feeling well. Baby strong. Thank you for asking." Dr. Harrison nodded approvingly. "Good to hear. You're taking proper care of yourself, I see. And you, Thomas, you're seeing she gets proper nutrition and rest?" "Every day," Mitchell confirmed. The doctors' public endorsement of their arrangement had a visible effect on the crowd. If Dr. Harrison, the most respected man in town, wasn't concerned about Sarah May's welfare, perhaps their outrage was misplaced. As they walked back to the wagon, Sarah May touched Mitchell's arm and showed him her journal. "Thank you for bringing me." "Needed to face them." "You handled yourself better than I expected," Mitchell admitted. "Those Bible verses were inspired." She wrote again. "Father made me memorize scripture. First time it was useful for more than Sunday service." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but the silence felt different from their early days together. There was a sense of shared purpose now, of having faced down adversity together and emerged stronger. Sarah May sat straighter, and Mitchell found himself planning their next visit to town with something approaching anticipation rather than dread. That evening, Sarah May spread the yellow fabric across the kitchen table and began sketching patterns for baby clothes. Mitchell watched from his chair by the fire, whittling a small wooden horse he'd started the night before. The domestic scene felt natural now, as if they'd been sharing these quiet evenings for years rather than days. "Sarah May," Mitchell said suddenly, "what you wrote today about us being partners, did you mean that?" She looked up from her sketching, pencil poised in her hand. After a moment, she reached for her journal. "Did you?" It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. Mitchell set down his whittling and looked around the room at the clean windows, the organized shelves, the signs of life returning to a house that had been merely surviving for too long. "I think I'm starting to," he said. "The question is, what kind of partnership are we talking about?" Sarah May considered this, tapping her pencil against her lips. When she finally wrote her response, it was longer than usual. Started as transaction. Father's desperation, your loneliness. But maybe could become choice, real partnership, business, family, future together. Need time to be sure, Mitchell nodded slowly. Time we have. And Sarah May? Whatever we decide, it'll be something we both choose. I won't hold you to any arrangement you don't want. She smiled then, the genuine expression that was becoming more frequent. She wrote one final note for the evening. First time anyone offered me real choice. Worth taking time to choose well. Outside, the wind carried the scent of approaching autumn. Soon the grass would turn gold, the cattle would need to be moved to winter pasture, and the baby would make their small family larger. But tonight, Thomas Mitchell and Sarah May Caldwell sat in companionable silence, each beginning to imagine a future that was more than either had dared hope for when a desperate father's wagon had first stirred the dust on the road to Copper Creek Valley. The foundation of their empire was being built not just in land and cattle, but in mutual respect, shared determination, and the quiet courage it took to choose love in a world that preferred judgment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were content to plan for the life they were building together, one careful decision at a time. October brought the kind of crisp mornings that made a man want to work with his hands and build something lasting. Thomas Mitchell stood at his kitchen window, watching Sarah May tend to the chicken coop with methodical care. In the 6 weeks since her arrival, she had transformed not just the house, but his entire perspective on what the ranch could become. The changes were everywhere. The vegetable garden she'd restored now produced late-season squash and root vegetables that would see them through winter. The chickens, previously neglected, were laying consistently under her attentive care. Even the house felt different, not just cleaner, but alive in a way it hadn't been since Catherine's death. But it was the conversation they'd had the night before that truly occupied Mitchell's thoughts. Sarah May had presented him with something extraordinary, a business plan, written in her careful script across several pages of her journal. She had been studying his ranch operations with the keen eye of someone who understood that survival required more than just getting by. Her pregnancy was advancing. She was 7 months along now, but her mind was sharper than ever, focused on building security for the child that would soon join their unusual family. The plan was ambitious but logical. Purchase 50 head of cattle before winter, when prices were lowest. Use the spring grass to fatten them, then sell half for profit while keeping the remainder to breed. Within 3 years, they could triple their herd size. Within 5, they'd need more land to support the operation. What impressed Mitchell most wasn't just the mathematical precision of her calculations, but the underlying assumption that they would be building this future together. Somewhere between her arrival and now, their arrangement had evolved from temporary shelter to permanent partnership. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mitchell opened it to find a stranger, a tall, lean man with weather-beaten features, and the kind of clothes that spoke of long days in the saddle. His horse, tied to the porch rail, bore the dust of many miles. "You'd be Thomas Mitchell," the man said. It wasn't a question. "I am. And you are?" "Jake Brennan. Heard you might be interested in expanding your cattle operation." Mitchell's eyebrows rose. "News travels fast in this territory. Who told you that?" Brennan smiled, an expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Word gets around. I represent some investors back east. Men with deep pockets who understand the potential of Montana cattle ranching." "What kind of investors?" "The kind who can provide the capital you need to build something really significant. I understand you have good land but limited livestock. That's a problem we can solve." Mitchell studied the man's face, noting the expensive boots and the gun that hung too easily at his hip. There was something about Brennan that set his teeth on edge, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. "I appreciate the offer," Mitchell said carefully, "but I prefer to build at my own pace with my own money." Brennan's smile widened. "Your own money? I hear you recently acquired some additional responsibilities. A young woman in a delicate condition. That sort of situation requires financial security, doesn't it?" The veiled threat in Brennan's words made Mitchell's jaw tighten. "My personal affairs are not your concern." "Of course not," Brennan said smoothly. "I'm simply suggesting that a man in your position might want to consider all available options. My employers are prepared to be very generous." Before Mitchell could respond, Sarah May appeared in the doorway. Her pregnancy was unmistakable now, but she carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had impressed him from the beginning. She nodded politely to Brennan, then moved to stand beside Mitchell. Brennan's eyes flickered over her with barely concealed interest. "You must be the young lady I've heard so much about. Quite a charitable arrangement Thomas has made." Sarah May's expression didn't change, but Mitchell felt the tension radiating from her. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her journal, writing quickly. "She wants to know what kind of business you're proposing," Mitchell translated. After reading her note, "The kind that could make you both very wealthy," Brennan replied. "Castle ranching on a scale this territory has never seen. My employers have the resources to make it happen." Sarah May wrote again, more urgently this time. Mitchell read her note, and his expression hardened. "She asks why Eastern investors would be interested in a small ranch in Montana territory." Mitchell said, "And frankly, so do I." Brennan's genial mask slipped slightly. "There's money to be made in beef, Mr. Mitchell. The railroad's coming. And when it does, every head of cattle in this territory will be worth twice what it is now. Smart men are positioning themselves to take advantage. And what would these smart men want in return? Partnership. Shared ownership of your land and livestock. You provide the local expertise. They provide the capital and connections." Mitchell exchanged a look with Sarah May. Her slight shake of the head confirmed his own instincts. "I think we'll pass," Mitchell said. "But I appreciate the offer." Brennan's face darkened. "You might want to reconsider. This territory can be challenging for small operators. Cattle theft, range wars, accidents. A man with a family to protect needs all the friends he can get." The threat was no longer veiled, and Mitchell stepped forward slightly. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Brennan?" "Just stating facts about frontier life," Brennan replied, backing toward his horse. "My employers don't like to be refused, Mr. Mitchell. I'd hate to see you regret your decision." After Brennan rode away, Mitchell found Sarah May sitting at the kitchen table, writing furiously in her journal. When she handed it to him, her message was clear and urgent. "Dangerous man. Eastern money means trouble. Must be careful." "You got that impression too," Mitchell said, settling into the chair across from her. She wrote again. Saw men like him before. Father dealt with land speculators. They don't take no for answer. Make problems for people who refuse. Mitchell studied her serious expression. What do you think we should do? Sarah May's response surprised him. Expand faster than planned. Build strength before they return. Show territory we're serious operation, not easy target. That's a risk. We'd be stretching our resources thin. She wrote quickly. Bigger risk to stay small. Weak animals get picked off by predators. Need to become predator ourselves. The metaphor was apt, and Mitchell found himself nodding slowly. Sarah May was right in the territorial economy. You were either growing or dying. Standing still made you vulnerable to men like Brennan and the shadowy investors he represented. The cattle auction in Bozeman is next week, Mitchell said thoughtfully. If we're going to do this, that would be the time. Sarah May reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing gently. When she let go, she wrote, We do this together. Equal partners. My money too. Your money? She pulled out a small leather pouch from her apron and set it on the table. Inside were gold coins, more than Mitchell had expected. Her next note explained, Mother's jewelry. Sold pieces in town while you were at cattle market last week. Mrs. Henley paid fair price, grudgingly. Mitchell stared at the coins, then at Sarah May. You sold your mother's jewelry for cattle? For our future, she wrote. Mother would understand. She always said build something worth leaving to children. The simple generosity of the gesture moved Mitchell more than he cared to admit. Sarah May was investing everything she had in there. Shared future, trusting him with not just her life, but her only remaining connection to her past. We'll need more than this, he said. I'll have to mortgage some of the land. How much land? Mitchell did quick calculations in his head. 500 acres, maybe 6. It's a risk if the cattle venture fails. We could lose everything. Sarah May wrote steadily. Already lost everything once, survived. If we fail together. If we succeed together. Better than failing alone. That afternoon, they rode to town together to meet with banker Edmund Fitzgerald about a loan. Sarah May had changed into her best dress, the blue calico that brought out her eyes, pinned her hair in a style that made her look older, more authoritative. The bank was a small but solid building that served the entire county. Fitzgerald himself was a cautious man who had survived the territory's economic ups and downs by making conservative loans to reliable people. He greeted Mitchell warmly but looked uncertain when Sarah May entered with him. Thomas, good to see you. And Miss Caldwell, isn't it? Sarah May is my business partner, Mitchell said firmly. Whatever we discuss today involves both of us. Fitzgerald's eyebrows rose slightly, but he gestured them to chairs in front of his desk. What can I do for you? Mitchell outlined their expansion plans while Sarah May pulled out her journal and began writing detailed notes and calculations. When Mitchell finished speaking, she handed the journal to Fitzgerald. The banker read her figures carefully, his expression growing more interested with each line. These projections are quite thorough, he said. You've calculated for livestock mortality, market fluctuations, feed costs. Most ranchers don't think this systematically. Sarah May wrote quickly and showed him the page. Must plan for problems. Territory doesn't forgive mistakes. Very true, Fitzgerald agreed. And you're both committed to this expansion. Completely, Mitchell said. Sarah May nodded firmly. Fitzgerald leaned back in his chair, studying them both. Ordinarily, I'd be hesitant to loan money for such an ambitious expansion. But you've got good land, Thomas, and he glanced at Sarah May's notes again. Someone who clearly understands the mathematics of ranching. Against my better judgment, I'm inclined to approve the loan. The terms were steep but fair, $600 against 500 acres of land to be repaid within 3 years with interest. It was everything Mitchell owned except the house and immediate grounds, but it would give them the capital to purchase 50 head of prime cattle. As they signed the papers, Fitzgerald offered one final piece of advice. There's talk around town about Eastern investors sniffing around local ranches, men with more money than scruples. You might want to be careful who you deal with. We've already met one of them, Mitchell said grimly, Jake Brennan. Fitzgerald's face darkened. Brennan's been asking questions about every successful ranch in the territory. My advice? Don't get involved with his people. That kind of money always comes with strings attached. Walking back to their wagon, Sarah May wrote in her journal, "Made right choice. Now work twice as hard to make it pay." No regrets? Mitchell asked. She stopped walking and looked at him directly. Then she wrote, "Only regret would be not trying. Mother always said fortune favors the bold. Time to be bold." As they drove home, the late afternoon sun painted the grass golden, and the future suddenly seemed full of possibility. In 1 week, they would travel to Bozeman to purchase their cattle. In 1 month, Sarah May's baby would be born. In 1 year, they would know whether their gamble had paid off, but tonight, they were partners in the truest sense, two people who had risked everything on each other, and on a shared vision of what their lives could become. The ranch that had been merely surviving was about to become something much more ambitious, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The blizzard that struck Montana Territory in late January of 1888 was the kind that old-timers would remember for decades. It began as a gentle snowfall on a Tuesday morning and escalated into a howling fury that buried fences, trapped cattle in ravines, and tested every rancher's preparation and resolve. For Thomas Mitchell and Sarah May, now 9 months pregnant and due any day, it became the crucible that would either forge their partnership into something unbreakable or destroy everything they had built. The cattle they had purchased in Bozeman were scattered across the winter pastures, 57 head of prime Herefords that represented every dollar they could borrow and every hope they carried for the future. Mitchell had spent weeks preparing for winter, building windbreaks and ensuring water sources wouldn't freeze. But no amount of preparation could have anticipated the ferocity of this particular storm. Sarah May felt the first labor pains as the wind began to howl around the house on Wednesday evening. She was kneading bread dough when the sensation hit a tightening across her belly that made her breath catch and her hands still on the flour-dusted surface. She looked out the kitchen window at the swirling snow and felt a moment of pure panic. Dr. Harrison was 15 miles away in Millbrook. The roads were already becoming impassable, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Sarah May pressed her lips together and continued kneading, as if she could will the baby to wait for better weather through sheer determination. Mitchell noticed her unusual stillness when he came in from checking the livestock. "Everything all right?" he asked, stamping snow from his boots. Sarah May reached for her journal with hands that trembled slightly. "Baby coming soon, I think." The blood drained from Mitchell's face. He looked out at the storm, then back at Sarah May, his mind racing through impossible calculations. "How soon?" she wrote quickly. "Pain started hour ago. Getting stronger." Mitchell was already moving, checking the windows, testing the door latches, mentally inventorying their supplies. "We can't get to Dr. Harrison in this weather. And he can't get to us." "I know," Sarah May wrote. "We'll have to manage ourselves." The simple acceptance in her written words steadied Mitchell's nerves. Sarah May had faced every challenge since her arrival with quiet courage, and she was facing this one the same way. If she could be brave, so could he. "What do you need me to do?" he asked over the next several hours as the storm raged outside. And Sarah May's labor progressed inside. They worked together with the same partnership that had characterized their entire relationship. Mitchell boiled water, gathered clean linens, and kept the fire burning bright and warm. Sarah May moved restlessly through the house, pausing when contractions hit, writing instructions for Mitchell when she could concentrate enough to form words. "Read Mother's Bible," she wrote during one break between pains. "Psalm 23, please." Mitchell had never been particularly religious, but he read the familiar words in a steady voice while Sarah May leaned against the kitchen table, breathing through another contraction. The Valley of the Shadow of Death seemed particularly relevant as the wind shrieked around the house and the responsibility of delivering a baby weighed on his shoulders. By midnight, the contractions were coming fast and hard. Sarah May had retreated to the bedroom, and Mitchell found himself in the position of midwife by necessity. He had helped with difficult births among his cattle, but this was different. This was Sarah May, the woman who had become more important to him than he'd ever thought possible, fighting to bring their child safely into the world. "Almost there," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Sarah May or himself. "You're doing fine, just fine." Sarah May couldn't write anymore, but her eyes found his across the lamplight, and the trust he saw there gave him strength. She had faith in him, even when he had none in himself. The baby was born just after 2 in the morning, as the storm reached its peak fury. A daughter, small but healthy, with a powerful cry that cut through the sound of the wind. Mitchell's hands shook as he cleaned her and wrapped her in the soft blankets Sarah May had sewn from yellow fabric months earlier. "She's beautiful," he said, placing the baby in Sarah May's arms. "Perfect." Sarah May's face was radiant despite her exhaustion. She touched the baby's tiny fingers, then reached weakly for her journal. "Our daughter. What should we name her?" The word "our" hit Mitchell like a physical blow. Not my daughter, but our daughter. In that moment, whatever legal arrangements had brought Sarah May to his ranch became irrelevant. They were a family now, bound by something far stronger than contracts or necessity. "Catherine," he said softly, "after my first wife. If that's all right with you." Sarah May smiled and nodded, writing with trembling fingers. "Catherine Sarah Mitchell." Good strong name for strong girl, but their relief was short-lived. As dawn broke gray and cold, Mitchell realized the storm had created a crisis that threatened everything they had worked for. The cattle were scattered and buried in snowdrifts. Several of the weaker animals had likely died during the night, and the rest would need immediate attention to survive. Sarah May was in no condition to help. She needed rest and warmth to recover from the difficult birth. But Mitchell couldn't handle the crisis alone. He stood at the bedroom door, watching mother and daughter sleep peacefully, and felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. That's when he heard the sound of horses approaching through the snow. Mitchell grabbed his rifle and peered out the front window. Through the swirling white, he could make out 3 riders, their faces wrapped in scarves, leading pack horses loaded with supplies. His finger tightened on the trigger until one of the riders called out in a familiar voice, "Thomas, it's Dr. Harrison." Mitchell threw open the door to find not just the doctor, but Jim Walsh from the general store and young Peter Sullivan, whose family ranch bordered Mitchell's property to the north. All 3 men were covered in snow and looked exhausted from fighting through the storm. "Heard the baby was coming," Dr. Harrison said, stamping into the house. "Couldn't let Sarah May face this alone. How did you know?" Mitchell asked, bewildered. Jim Walsh pulled off his hat, shaking snow from it. "Mary Catherine Bell came by the store yesterday morning. Said she had a feeling, what with the storm coming and Sarah May so close to her time. We've been traveling since before dawn." Dr. Harrison was already moving toward the bedroom. "Let me check on mother and baby. Then we'll deal with whatever other problems this storm has created." While the doctor examined Sarah May and baby Catherine, the other men helped Mitchell assess the damage to his operation. It was worse than he'd feared. 15 head of cattle were missing, likely buried in snowdrifts or scattered by the wind. Several outbuildings had been damaged, and the water troughs were frozen solid. "We'll help you round up the cattle," Peter Sullivan said without being asked. "My boys are out looking for our own stock. We can search for yours at the same time." "I can't pay you," Mitchell said bluntly. "Every dollar I had went into buying those animals." Jim Walsh waved off his concern. "Who said anything about payment? Neighbors help neighbors. That's how we all survive out here." Over the next 3 days, as Sarah May recovered and baby Catherine grew stronger, the men of the territory rallied to help save Mitchell's investment. They found 12 of the missing cattle alive but weak, trapped in a ravine where the snow had provided shelter. 2 were found dead, frozen in the open pasture. 1 was never found at all. The loss was significant, but not catastrophic. More importantly, Mitchell realized he was no longer the isolated widower he had been before Sarah May's arrival. The community that had initially judged their arrangement now accepted them as a family worth protecting. Dr. Harrison stayed for a week, monitoring Sarah May's recovery and marveling at baby Catherine's robust health despite her dramatic entrance into the world. Before leaving, he pulled Mitchell aside for a private conversation. "You've done well, Thomas," the doctor said. "Better than I expected when this arrangement began. Sarah May is thriving, the baby is healthy, and you've built something solid." "Here, the cattle operation nearly failed," Mitchell pointed out, "but it didn't. And you know why? Because you've earned the respect of your neighbors. When Jake Brennan came around asking questions about your ranch last week, Jim Walsh told him in no uncertain terms that you weren't interested in outside investors." Mitchell's head snapped up. "Brennan was here during the storm?" "Came by the store on Friday, asking about your cattle losses. Seemed very interested in whether you'd be able to make your loan payments." Jim told him it was none of his business. The information sent a chill down Mitchell's spine. Brennan was watching, waiting for signs of weakness. The cattle losses could have been exactly the opening he was looking for. That evening, as Sarah May nursed baby Catherine by the fire and Mitchell worked on ranch accounts, he shared what Dr. Harrison had told him. Sarah May listened intently, then reached for her journal. "Expected this," she wrote. "Men like Brennan circle like vultures. Must show strength, not weakness. How? We lost 12 head of cattle and nearly went bankrupt. Sarah May wrote steadily. We survived, baby born healthy. Neighbors helped, community supports us now. That's strength Brennan can't buy." She was right. The storm had tested them in ways Mitchell never could have anticipated, but it had also proven something important. They weren't just building a cattle operation. They were building a life that others valued and wanted to protect. As if summoned by their conversation, a knock came at the door. Mitchell opened it to find Mary Catherine Bell standing on the porch, holding a covered basket. "Brought soup for Sarah May," the young woman said, "and wanted to see the baby, if that's all right." Mitchell invited her in, and Mary Catherine's face lit up when she saw baby Catherine sleeping peacefully in Sarah May's arms. "She's beautiful," Mary Catherine whispered. "And you look wonderful, Sarah May. Motherhood suits you." Sarah May smiled and wrote in her journal, "Thank you for bringing Dr. Harrison. Saved our lives." Mary Catherine blushed. "I just had a feeling." Sometimes women know these things. As Mary Catherine prepared to leave, she hesitated at the door. "There's something you should know. Jake Brennan's been asking questions around town. About your finances, your cattle losses, whether you'll be able to keep the ranch." "What kind of questions?" Mitchell asked. "The kind that suggest he's planning something. Be careful, Thomas." Sarah May. Men like him don't give up easily. After Mary Catherine left, Mitchell and Sarah May sat in contemplative silence. The storm had passed, but they both sensed that a different kind of tempest was gathering, one that would test not their ability to survive nature's fury, but their determination to protect what they had built from human predators. "Whatever comes next," Mitchell said quietly, "we face it together." Sarah May nodded and wrote one final note for the evening. Together, we're stronger than anything Brennan can bring. Let him come. Outside, the snow continued to fall gently, covering the scars left by the blizzard and preparing the ground for spring. In a few months, their surviving cattle would calve, doubling their herd size. In a few years, if their plan succeeded, they would own one of the largest ranches in the territory. But tonight, they were content to sit by the fire with their newborn daughter, knowing they had survived their first real test as a family and emerged stronger than before. The empire they were building was founded on more than land and cattle. It was built on love, partnership, and the unshakable determination of two people who had found something worth fighting for. Spring of 1888 brought more than just green grass to Copper Creek Valley. It brought the kind of opportunity that could make or break a ranching operation, and with it, the most dangerous test yet of Thomas Mitchell and Sarah May's growing empire. Baby Catherine was 3 months old, thriving in the mountain air, and the surviving cattle had not only recovered from the winter storm, but were showing signs of excellent health as they prepared for calving season. It was during this period of cautious optimism that Marcus Whitmore arrived in Millbrook. Unlike Jake Brennan's rough-hewn appearance, Whitmore was polished in the way that only Eastern money could achieve. His suits were tailored, his boots handmade, and his manner suggested a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through charm rather than threats. He took rooms at the town's only hotel and immediately began making himself known to the local business community. Sarah May first spotted him through the window of Walsh's General Store. During one of their weekly trips to town, she was nursing Catherine on a bench outside while Thomas loaded supplies, when a well-dressed stranger emerged from the bank across the street. Something about his purposeful stride and calculating gaze made her reach for her journal. When Thomas returned to the wagon, she showed him her note. Dangerous man at bank. Expensive clothes, predator eyes, not local. Thomas followed her gaze and felt his stomach tighten. That's not Brennan. Worse than Brennan, Sarah May wrote quickly. This one thinks before he acts. They learned the stranger's identity that evening when Dr. Harrison stopped by their ranch for Catherine's regular checkup. The doctor's usually cheerful demeanor was troubled as he examined the baby. There's a new man in town, Dr. Harrison said without preamble. Marcus Whitmore. Claims to represent a railroad development company looking to invest in local cattle operations. Thomas and Sarah May exchanged glances. Railroad? Thomas asked. Says the Northern Pacific is planning a spur line through the territory. Claims ranchers who partner with his company will have exclusive contracts to supply beef to railroad construction crews and eventually to Eastern markets. Sarah May was already writing. Too convenient. Why now? Why us? Dr. Harrison read her note and nodded grimly. My thoughts exactly. Whitmore's been asking very specific questions about your operation, Thomas. He knows exactly how many cattle you own, what you paid for them, and the terms of your loan with the bank. Fitzgerald wouldn't share that information, Thomas protested. No, but Brennan might have gathered it during his visits last fall. This feels coordinated. That night, after Dr. Harrison left and Catherine was sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Thomas and Sarah May sat at their kitchen table planning their response. Sarah May had filled several pages of her journal with calculations and observations. What are you thinking? Thomas asked. She showed him her notes. 2 possibilities. Railroad story is real. They want legitimate partnership. Or railroad story is lie. They want to force us into bad deal or take ranch entirely. How do we find out which? Sarah May turned to a fresh page and wrote steadily. Make them prove railroad connection. Real railroad company has documentation, schedules, official correspondence. Fake company has only promises. And if it's real, then we negotiate from strength, not desperation. Our cattle operation is succeeding. We don't need them, they need us. The opportunity to test Whitmore's claims came sooner than expected. 2 days later, the well-dressed Easterner arrived at their ranch in a hired buggy, accompanied by a man he introduced as his surveyor. Whitmore's smile was practiced and confident as he stepped onto their porch. "Mr. Mitchell, I presume? And the lovely Mrs. Mitchell?" Whitmore's assumption about their marital status was deliberate, designed to put them at ease while gathering information about their relationship. "Miss Caldwell," Sarah May corrected politely, offering her hand. "We're business partners." Whitmore's eyes sharpened slightly at this information, but his smile never wavered. "How refreshingly modern. I represent the Montana Territory Development Corporation, and I believe we have an opportunity that could benefit us both tremendously." Thomas invited them inside, where Whitmore launched into an elaborate presentation about railroad expansion and the fortunes to be made in beef contracts. His surveyor, a nervous man named Phillips, spread maps across their kitchen table, pointing out proposed rail lines and depot locations. "The beauty of our arrangement," Whitmore explained, "is that it requires minimal investment from you while guaranteeing substantial returns. We provide the capital for herd expansion. You provide the land and expertise. When the railroad contracts begin, we all profit handsomely." Sarah May listened intently while nursing Catherine, occasionally jotting notes in her journal. When Whitmore finished his presentation, she handed Thomas a page with a single question. "Ask to see railroad company. Documentation." "That sounds very promising," Thomas said. "I'd like to review the official railroad correspondence and development contracts before making any decisions." Whitmore's smile flickered for just a moment. "Of course. Unfortunately, I don't carry such sensitive documents with me while traveling. Corporate policy, you understand. But I can arrange for you to review everything at our Denver offices." "Denver's a long way to travel for a meeting," Thomas observed. "Which is why I'm authorized to present you with this preliminary agreement," Whitmore said, producing an elegant leather portfolio. "Sign this letter of intent, and we'll handle all the paperwork remotely." Sarah May was writing furiously. She showed Thomas her note. Real railroad wouldn't need letter of intent. Would have local offices, territorial representatives. "This is trap." Thomas closed the portfolio without reading it. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Whitmore, but we prefer to conduct business with local representatives of established companies. If the Northern Pacific is truly planning expansion through this territory, they'll have territorial offices we can visit." Whitmore's mask slipped completely. "Mr. Mitchell, opportunities like this don't come along often. My investors are prepared to be very generous, but they expect decisiveness from their partners." "Your investors?" Thomas stood slowly. "I thought you represented a railroad development company." "I represent various interests," Whitmore said smoothly. "But the damage was done." He'd revealed that his story was a fabrication. Sarah May sat Catherine in her cradle and picked up her journal, writing quickly before showing the page to Whitmore. "We know you're working with Jake Brennan. We know there's no railroad contract. What do you really want?" The directness of her challenge caught Whitmore off guard. He looked from the journal to Sarah May's steady gaze, clearly reassessing his approach. "You're more perceptive than I was led to believe," he said finally. "Very well. My associates are interested in acquiring profitable ranching operations in this territory. Your operation shows promise, but you're undercapitalized and vulnerable to market fluctuations. So you want to buy us out," Thomas said. "We want to make you an offer you'd be foolish to refuse. $5,000 for your land, livestock, and equipment. Enough to start over anywhere you choose." Sarah May was already writing her response. "Our cattle alone will be worth more than that in 2 years. Our land is worth 3 times your offer. You're trying to steal what we've built." Whitmore read her note with growing irritation. "Miss Caldwell, you're in no position to negotiate. Your loan payments will increase next year. One bad season, one cattle disease outbreak, One market downturn, and you'll lose everything anyway. That's our risk to take, Thomas said firmly. Whitmore's genial facade finally cracked completely. You're making a serious mistake. My associates don't appreciate being refused, especially by... He glanced dismissively at Sarah May. Unconventional arrangements like yours. Thomas stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle hanging over the fireplace. I think this conversation is over. Indeed it is, Whitmore agreed, gathering his papers. But it's not the end of our business together, I assure you. After Whitmore and his surveyor left, Thomas and Sarah May spent the evening analyzing what they'd learned. Sarah May filled pages with observations and strategic considerations. They're planning something, Thomas said, reading over her notes. This wasn't just a business offer, it was reconnaissance. Sarah May wrote, agreed. Now they know our defenses, our financial situation, our relationship dynamic. Will use information against us. So what do we do? Sarah May's response was characteristically direct. We accelerate our plans. Build faster and stronger than they expect. Make ourselves too valuable to destroy and too powerful to intimidate. That means taking bigger risks. Bigger risks, bigger rewards, and Thomas... She paused in her writing, then continued. Time to make our partnership official. Legal marriage protects both of us and Catherine from certain types of attacks. The suggestion caught Thomas off guard, though he realized it made perfect strategic sense. A legal marriage would give Sarah May claim to the property and make it much harder for outside forces to exploit their unconventional arrangement. Is that what you want? He asked quietly. A marriage of convenience? Sarah May looked at him for a long moment, then wrote, started as convenience, became partnership, growing into something deeper. You? Thomas felt his heart race as he read. Her words. I was hoping you'd say that. Yes, it's becoming something deeper for me too. She smiled and wrote one final note. Then we marry for love and strategy. Best of both worlds. 3 weeks later, in a simple ceremony in their own parlor with Dr. Harrison, the Walshes and young Mary Catherine Bell as witnesses, Thomas Mitchell and Sarah May Caldwell became husband and wife in the eyes of the law and their community. Baby Catherine gurgled happily throughout the proceedings, as if she approved of the official recognition of what had been true for months. But even as they celebrated their new legal status, both Thomas and Sarah May knew that Marcus Whitmore and his mysterious associates wouldn't give up easily. The real test of their empire was yet to come, and it would require every ounce of strategic thinking, community support, and personal courage they could muster. The foundation they had built was strong, but it was about to face forces that would test whether love and determination were enough to protect what they had built against enemies with unlimited resources and no scruples about how they achieved their goals. That night, as they lay in their marriage bed for the first time as husband and wife, Sarah May wrote one final entry in her journal. Empire built on love is stronger than empire built on fear. Let them come. Outside their window, the Montana Territory stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, holding secrets and possibilities that would reshape their world in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But whatever came next, they would face it as true partners. In every sense of the word, the summer of 1888 brought more than abundant grass and thriving cattle to the Mitchell Ranch. It brought war, the kind of quiet, methodical campaign that wealthy men wage against those who dare to refuse their offers. Marcus Whitmore had left Millbrook after his failed negotiation, but his influence remained like poison seeping through the territory's economic bloodstream. The first sign of trouble came in July, when their usual hay supplier, old Henrik Johansson, arrived at the ranch looking uncomfortable and apologetic. Henrik had been providing winter feed to area ranchers for 15 years, but now he stood hat in hand on their porch, delivering news that made Thomas's jaw clench with anger. "I'm sorry, Thomas," Henrik said, his Swedish accent thick with distress. "I cannot sell to you this year. My other contracts, they require exclusive arrangements now." Sarah May, nursing 6-month-old Catherine in the rocking chair Thomas had built for her, looked up sharply. She reached for her journal and wrote quickly, "Who demanded exclusive arrangements?" Henrik read her note and shifted nervously. "New buyers. They pay premium prices, but they want guaranteed supply. I cannot afford to lose such contracts." "What? New buyers?" Thomas asked. "Montana Territory Development Corporation," Henrik admitted. "They are buying hay throughout the valley. Say they need it for big railroad project." Thomas and Sarah May exchanged grim looks. They both knew there was no railroad project. This was Whitmore's way of squeezing their operation by cutting off essential supplies out after Henrik left. Sarah May wrote a detailed analysis of their situation. Classic siege tactics. Cut off supplies. Drive up costs, force financial crisis. Must find alternative hay sources or grow our own. Growing our own would mean converting grazing land to hay production, Thomas pointed out. That reduces our cattle capacity. Temporary sacrifice for long-term independence, she wrote. Cannot allow enemies to control our survival. But hay was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, the pressure intensified with surgical precision. The grain dealer in Millbrook suddenly couldn't supply feed corn. All his inventory was committed to the railroad project. The blacksmith who had been shoeing their horses and repairing equipment found his schedule fully booked with railroad contracts. Even the bank began asking pointed questions about their loan repayment schedule, though Edmund Fitzgerald assured them privately that their account was in good standing. The campaign reached a new level of sophistication when Sarah May discovered that someone was spreading rumors about diseased cattle on their ranch. The story was carefully crafted, not dramatic enough to attract official attention, but persistent enough to worry potential buyers. When they drove a small herd to the Bozeman cattle market in August, they found buyers mysteriously reluctant to make offers. "Sorry, Mitchell," said cattle broker John Morrison, a man who had always dealt fairly with them before. "Word is you might have problems with tick fever. Can't risk bringing diseased stock into a healthy herd." Thomas's face flushed with anger. "Our cattle are healthier than anything in this territory. Dr. Harrison inspected them himself last week." Morrison shrugged apologetically. "May be true, but rumors are rumors. Bad for business to take chances." Sarah May, who had accompanied them to the market carrying Catherine in a sling she'd sewn herself, wrote furiously in her journal, "Systematic character assassination. Must prove cattle health publicly and dramatically." That evening, in their hotel room in Bozeman, Sarah May outlined a counter-strategy that was audacious in its scope. She wrote page after page, her handwriting swift and determined as she laid out a plan that would either save their ranch or destroy it completely. "Rid this," she said, handing Thomas the journal. Thomas read her proposal twice, his eyebrows rising with each paragraph. "This is incredibly risky, Sarah May. If it fails, we lose everything." She took the journal back and wrote, "Already losing everything slowly. Better to risk big for big reward than die by 1,000 cuts." Her plan was elegantly simple in concept, but complex in execution. Instead of trying to compete with Whitmore's economic pressure, they would bypass the entire local market system. They would drive their entire herd, now grown to over 200 head with spring calving, directly to the stockyards in Chicago, where they could sell at premium prices to Eastern meatpackers. The journey would be dangerous and expensive, requiring hired drovers, supplies for weeks on the trail, and navigation through unfamiliar territory. If they lost cattle to rustlers, disease, or natural disasters, they would be ruined. But if they succeeded, they would earn enough money to pay off their bank loan entirely and establish themselves as a major player in the territorial cattle trade. "It's never been done from this far north," Thomas said. The logistics alone... Sarah May was already writing her response. Oregon Trail. Was never tried either, until someone tried it. We have advantages: good cattle, excellent grass to fatten them, direct rail connections from Chicago to eastern markets. Problem is not feasibility, but courage. Thomas looked at his wife, for he had grown accustomed to thinking of her that way, though their marriage was barely 3 months old, and saw the same quiet determination that had impressed him from their first meeting. Sarah May never suggested anything she hadn't thought through completely. How do we finance the drive? He asked. Mortgage remaining land, she wrote. Use proceeds to hire drovers, buy supplies, pay for rail shipment from Chicago. High risk but higher potential reward than anything else available. That would put our entire ranch at stake. Ranch already at stake. Whitmore will squeeze until we surrender or fight back. I prefer fighting. The next morning, they returned to Millbrook and immediately went to see Edmund Fitzgerald at the bank. The banker listened to their proposal with growing amazement and concern. You want to mortgage your remaining land to finance a cattle drive to Chicago? Fitzgerald repeated. Thomas, that's over 1,000 miles through some of the most dangerous territory in the West. The railroad runs most of the way now, Thomas pointed out. We'd only have to drive them about 400 miles to reach the nearest railhead. Sarah May was writing quickly. She showed Fitzgerald her calculation. Chicago beef prices currently 40% higher than local prices. Even accounting for drive costs and rail shipping, profit margin exceeds 200% of current local sales. Fitzgerald studied her figures with the respect he'd learned to have for Sarah May's mathematical abilities. The numbers work, assuming you don't lose half your herd to rustlers or stampedes. We won't, Thomas said with more confidence then. He felt. Sarah May wrote again. Need loan of $1,200. Will repay within 6 months with 20% interest. Double bank's usual rate. The generous interest offer got Fitzgerald's attention. Banks in frontier territories made their money on exactly these kinds of high-risk, high-reward investments. I'd need collateral on every acre you own, Fitzgerald warned. Understood, Thomas said. We're betting everything on this drive. Sarah May added one final note. Not betting. Investing. Big difference. A week later, they had their loan and began the complex process of organizing the most ambitious cattle drive in Montana Territory history. They hired 6 experienced drovers, including a grizzled trail boss named Samuel Bull Rodriguez, who had driven herds from Texas to Kansas before the northern railroads made such journeys profitable. You're either crazy or genius, Bull told them after reviewing their route plans. But I've seen crazier things work out, and your cattle are prime stock. If we can get them to Chicago in good condition, you'll make a fortune. The preparations took 3 weeks. They assembled supplies for a month on the trail, mapped water sources and grazing areas, and arranged for rail cars to be waiting at the railhead in Miles City. Sarah May coordinated the logistics with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, while Thomas worked with the drovers to prepare the cattle for the long journey. Word of their planned drive spread quickly through the territory, generating reactions that ranged from admiration to disbelief. Marcus Whitmore, who had returned to Millbrook ostensibly to oversee his railroad project, made his displeasure clear during a chance encounter at Walsh's General Store. Rather a desperate gamble, isn't it, Mitchell? Whitmore said with studied casualness as they both waited for supplies. Driving cattle through Indian Territory and Badlands on the hope of Chicago prices. Not a gamble, Thomas replied. A business decision based on market analysis. Whitmore smiled coldly. I hope your business partner has considered what happens to a young mother if her husband doesn't return from such a dangerous journey. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas felt his hand move instinctively toward his gun, but Sarah May touched his arm lightly and shook her head. She wrote quickly in her journal and showed Whitmore the page. Threats against my family will be remembered. Better men than you have underestimated me. Whitmore read her note and for the first time showed genuine uncertainty. There was something in Sarah May's calm confidence that suggested she was not someone to threaten lightly. Of course I meant. No threat, Whitmore said smoothly. Merely expressing concern for your welfare. Save your concern, Thomas said. We can take care of ourselves. The cattle drive began on September 15th, 1888, with 237 head of prime Hereford cattle, and a small group of people determined to prove that courage and intelligence could overcome economic pressure from powerful enemies. Thomas rode point with Bull Rodriguez, while Sarah May remained at the ranch with Catherine and a small crew to maintain the property. As the dust cloud from the departing herd settled over Copper Creek Valley, Sarah May stood on her porch holding her daughter and watching her husband disappear into the distance. In her free hand, she held her journal where she had written, "A simple declaration. Today we either become an empire or lose everything trying. Either way, we choose our own fate." The next 6 weeks would determine whether the quiet, pregnant girl sold by her desperate father had indeed built something that could shock the entire territory, or whether Marcus Whitmore's sophisticated campaign of economic warfare would succeed in destroying the most successful partnership the Montana Territory had ever seen. But Sarah May felt no fear as she watched the herd disappear into the endless grassland. She had learned to trust in the power of careful planning, unwavering determination, and the strength that came from having something worth fighting for. The empire they were building was about to face its greatest test, and she was ready for whatever came next. The 3 weeks after Thomas left with the cattle drive were the longest of Sarah May's life. Alone on the ranch with baby Catherine and only 2 hired hands to maintain the property, she found herself responsible for protecting everything they had built while her husband risked their future on a 1,000-mile gamble through dangerous territory. Marcus Whitmore wasted no time testing her resolve. 2 days after the dust from the cattle drive had settled, a delegation arrived at the ranch. Whitmore led the group, flanked by Sheriff Blackwood from the county seat and a man Sarah May didn't recognize, tall, pale, and wearing the kind of expensive suit that screamed Eastern money. Behind them rode 4 men who looked more like hired guns than legitimate businessmen. Sarah May watched their approach from the kitchen window while Catherine napped in her cradle nearby. She had been expecting something like this. Whitmore would see Thomas's absence as an opportunity to pressure her when she was most vulnerable. What she hadn't expected was the involvement of law enforcement. She checked the loaded rifle hanging above the fireplace, verified that her journal and pencil were within reach, and stepped onto the porch to meet them. Her hired hands, Pete Morrison and young Billy Garrett, emerged from the barn and took positions where they could see the visitors clearly. "Mrs. Mitchell," Whitmore said with mock courtesy as he dismounted, "I hope you're managing well in your husband's absence." Sarah May nodded politely but remained silent, her hands folded calmly in front of her. Sheriff Blackwood, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm Sheriff Blackwood. I need to ask you some questions about your cattle operation." Sarah May reached for her journal and wrote quickly, "What questions? Operation is entirely legal." Blackwood read her note with obvious discomfort. "There have been allegations of cattle theft. Claims that some of the animals in your recent drive were stolen from neighboring ranches." The accusation hit Sarah May like a physical blow, but she kept her expression neutral. She wrote carefully, "False accusations. Our cattle, well documented, can provide bills of sale for every animal." The third man stepped forward, the pale Easterner with calculating eyes. "I'm Harrison Volker, Territorial Livestock Inspector. I'm afraid documentation can be forged. We need to examine your remaining stock and verify ownership." Sarah May studied Volker's face, noting the soft hands and city pallor. This man had never inspected livestock in his life. She wrote, Show me your credentials and authorization. Volker's eyes narrowed. I don't need to justify my authority to you, woman. The casual insult was a mistake. Sarah May had endured too much and overcome too many obstacles to be intimidated by Eastern arrogance. She wrote with sharp, angry strokes. I am not woman. I am Mrs. Sarah May Mitchell, co-owner of this ranch. You will address me with respect or leave my property. Sheriff Blackwood read her note and shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Mitchell, we're just trying to clear up these allegations. If you cooperate, this can all be resolved quickly. Sarah May wrote again. Allegations made by whom? What evidence presented? Who benefits from damaging our reputation? The questions were pointed and logical, cutting through the pretense to expose the real motivation behind the visit. Blackwood glanced at Whitmore, who stepped forward smoothly. Mrs. Mitchell, these legal complications could be resolved much more easily if you were willing to discuss the generous offer my associates made to your husband. With him away on this risky venture, perhaps you might reconsider our partnership. Proposal. There it was, the real purpose of the visit. Use false accusations and legal pressure to force her into accepting their buyout offer while Thomas was away and unable to defend their interests. Sarah May smiled coldly and wrote, My husband and I make decisions together. I have no authority to negotiate in his absence. But you do have authority to protect your child, Volker said meaningfully, glancing toward the house where Catherine's crying could be heard as she woke from her nap. A young mother shouldn't have to face legal troubles alone. The veiled threat against her daughter made Sarah May's blood run cold, but it also steeled her resolve. She wrote quickly and held up the journal so all the men could read. Any threats against my family will be reported to territorial authorities. I know the difference between legitimate law enforcement and intimidation. Sheriff Blackwood flushed red. Now see here, nobody's threatening. Actually, interrupted a new voice, it sounds exactly like threats to me. Everyone turned to see Dr. Harrison riding up the path, his medical bag tied to his saddle and his usually gentle face set in hard lines. Behind him rode Jim Walsh and two other men from town. Doctor, Whitmore said with forced joviality. How fortunate. Perhaps you can convince Mrs. Mitchell to be reasonable about these legal matters. Dr. Harrison dismounted and walked directly to Sarah May. Are you and Catherine all right? He asked. Sarah May nodded and wrote, They're trying to intimidate me while Thomas is away. False accusations about stolen cattle. Dr. Harrison read her note, then turned to face the delegation. Sheriff Blackwood, I'm surprised to see you harassing a young mother based on accusations from ... He looked pointedly at Whitmore. Questionable sources. This is official business, Blackwood protested. Then you'll have official documentation. Dr. Harrison said calmly. Warrants, court orders, sworn affidavits from alleged victims. Let's see them. The silence that followed was telling. Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. Volker's face darkened, and Whitmore's mask of civility began to slip. The documentation is being prepared, Volker said finally. Then come back when you have it, Jim Walsh said, joining the conversation. In the meantime, Mrs. Mitchell is under the protection of this community. Community protection, Whitmore sneered. How quaint. But communities can't protect against market forces, gentlemen, or against the consequences of poor business decisions. Sarah May was writing furiously. When she finished, she handed the journal to Dr. Harrison, who read aloud. Mr. Whitmore's threats are noted and will be reported to territorial governor. False accusations will be prosecuted to full extent of law. This ranch is not for sale at any price. Whitmore's facade finally cracked completely. You're making a serious mistake, Mrs. Mitchell. My associates have substantial resources and long memories. When your husband's foolish cattle drive fails, and it will fail, you'll wish you had accepted our generous terms. That sounds like a threat to me, Dr. Harrison observed. Sheriff, Are you going to arrest this man for threatening a citizen of your county? Blackwood looked caught between his obvious obligations and whatever pressure Whitmore's people had applied. That is, perhaps we should return when we have proper documentation. Excellent idea, Dr. Harrison agreed. And Sheriff? Next time you visit this ranch, I suggest you verify that your companions are actually who they claim to be. Mr. Volker's credentials might not withstand close examination. The delegation retreated, but not before Whitmore delivered one final warning. This isn't over, Mrs. Mitchell. My employers don't accept defeat gracefully. After they left, Dr. Harrison and the other men stayed for supper, taking turns keeping watch through the night. Sarah May appreciated their protection, but she knew it was only temporary. Whitmore would try again, and next time he might not bother with the pretense of legal authority. The following morning brought news that made her situation even more precarious. Young Billy Garrett rode in from town with a telegram that had arrived at Walsh's store. Sarah May's hands trembled as she read the brief message. Cattle rustlers hit drive stop 20. Head loss stop continuing to Chicago. Stop tell Sarah May. I love her. Stop Thomas. The loss was serious but not catastrophic. They still had over 200 head of cattle. Enough to make the drive profitable if they reached Chicago safely. But the telegram confirmed that Whitmore's reach extended far beyond Millbrook. The rustlers who had attacked the drive were almost certainly in his employ. Sarah May spent the next 2 days preparing for siege. She moved Catherine's cradle into the most secure room of the house, stockpiled ammunition and medical supplies, and sent messages to all their allies in the territory. If Whitmore wanted a war, she would give him one. The attack came on a moonless night 3 days later. Sarah May woke to the sound of horses moving stealthily around the house. She grabbed her rifle and crept to the window, where she could see dark figures positioning themselves around the property. They had come prepared for violence. She counted at least 8 men, all armed. She woke Pete and Billy, who had been sleeping in the barn. With a predetermined signal, 3 sharp whistle blasts that carried clearly in the still air. Then she settled into position at the front window and waited. The first shot shattered the kitchen window. Sarah May returned fire immediately, her bullet striking one of the attackers in the shoulder and sending him tumbling from his horse. The battle was brief but fierce. 20 minutes of gunfire that lit up the night and brought neighbors running from miles away. When dawn broke, 4 of the attackers were dead and 3 others wounded badly enough to require medical attention. The 8th had fled when Dr. Harrison arrived with reinforcements from town. None of the defenders had been seriously injured, though Billy Garrett had taken a graze across his forearm that would leave a permanent scar. Sheriff Blackwood arrived 2 hours after the fighting ended, ostensibly to investigate the attack. He found Sarah May sitting on her porch, nursing Catherine as if nothing had happened, while bodies were being loaded into wagons for transport to town. Quite a fight, Blackwood observed. Sarah May wrote in her journal, self-defense against armed attackers. All witnesses available to testify. Any idea who these men were? She wrote again, asked Marcus Whitmore. They worked for him. Blackwood studied her note uncomfortably. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth, Dr. Harrison said, joining the conversation. And if you were doing your job properly, Sheriff, you'd be investigating Mr. Whitmore instead of harassing honest ranchers. The attack proved to be Whitmore's crucial mistake. Instead of intimidating Sarah May, it had rallied the entire Tory. To her defense, news of the night battle spread quickly, and public opinion turned decisively against the Eastern investors and their local collaborators. More importantly, the attack had failed to achieve its primary objective. Sarah May was still alive, still defending the ranch, and still waiting for Thomas to return with news of their Chicago gamble. 3 weeks later, another telegram arrived that would change everything. Chicago sale successful. Stop cattle brought. Premium prices. Stop returning with enough money to buy Whitmore and his bosses. Stop your husband loves his warrior wife. Stop Thomas. Sarah May read the telegram twice, then sat down heavily on her porch steps and cried not from sadness, but from relief and overwhelming joy. They had done it. Against all odds, despite economic warfare and armed attacks, they had built something that would endure. The empire that began with a desperate father's transaction had survived its greatest test and emerged stronger than ever. But the final confrontation with Marcus Whitmore and his Eastern employers was still to come, and Sarah May knew it would determine not just their financial future, but the kind of territory Montana would become. Thomas Mitchell returned to Copper Creek Valley on a crisp October morning in 1888, leading a wagon train that would become legend throughout the Montana Territory. Behind him rode Bull Rodriguez and the surviving drovers, their faces weathered by 6 weeks on the trail, but their spirits high with the satisfaction of a job completed against impossible odds. Most importantly, Thomas carried with him a leather satchel containing bank drafts worth more money than most ranchers saw in a lifetime. The cattle drive to Chicago had exceeded even Sarah May's optimistic projections. The premium beef market had paid top dollar for their grass-fed Herefords, and Thomas had negotiated contracts for future deliveries that would secure their financial future for years to come. But the numbers in his satchel represented more than profit. They represented power, the kind that could reshape territorial politics and settle scores with Eastern investors who thought they could intimidate frontier families with impunity. Sarah May stood on the porch holding Catherine, now 9 months old and beginning to toddle around the furniture. She watched the dust cloud grow larger as the wagon train approached, her heart racing with anticipation and relief. The past 6 weeks had tested her in ways she never could have imagined, but she had survived and protected everything they had built together. When Thomas finally dismounted and swept her into his arms, the embrace conveyed everything that words couldn't capture. They had gambled everything on a desperate plan, faced armed enemies and corrupt officials, and emerged victorious against odds that should have destroyed them. The telegram didn't lie, Thomas murmured against her hair. We did it, Sarah May. We actually did it. She pulled back to look at him, noting the new lines around his eyes and the confidence in his bearing. The cattle drive had changed him, just as defending the ranch had changed her. They were no longer the desperate widower and pregnant girl who had found each other through her father's transaction. They were partners in the truest sense, equals who had proven they could build an empire from nothing but determination and mutual trust. That evening, after the drovers had been paid and fed and sent on their way with bonuses that would make them loyal allies for life, Thomas and Sarah May sat at their kitchen table, reviewing the astounding success of their venture. The bank drafts spread across. The surface represented enough money to pay off their loan, purchase additional land, and expand their operation beyond anything Montana Territory had ever seen. We need to move quickly, Thomas said, studying Sarah May's latest calculations. Word of our success will reach Whitmore and his people within days. They'll try to find new ways to attack us before we can consolidate our position. Sarah May wrote in her journal, "Let them try. We're not the same people they tried to intimidate. Time to show territory what real power looks like." The next morning, they rode to Millbrook together, Thomas, Sarah May, and baby Catherine, to begin the process of transforming their cattle ranch into something that would reshape the entire region's economy. Their first stop was Edmund Fitzgerald's bank, where they intended to pay off their loan in full and negotiate for additional capital. Fitzgerald's eyes widened when Thomas placed the bank drafts on his desk. "Good Lord, Thomas. How much did you clear from that drive?" "Enough to pay our debt and finance the next phase of expansion," Thomas replied. "We want to purchase the Henderson Ranch to the south and the Morrison Spread to the east. Cash offers, no financing required." "That would give you control of nearly 15,000 acres, Fitzgerald said, clearly awed by the scope of their ambition. You'd be the largest landowner in the territory. Sarah May wrote quickly, not largest, most efficient. Will run cattle. Operation like Eastern businesses run factories. Scientific breeding, systematic management, coordinated marketing. Fitzgerald read her note with growing excitement. Banks profited when their customers succeeded on a large scale, and the Mitchells were clearly thinking bigger than anyone in territorial history. I can arrange the land purchases, Fitzgerald said. But acquisitions this large will attract attention. Are you prepared for the political complications? We're prepared for whatever comes, Thomas said grimly, including Marcus Whitmore and his Eastern bosses. As if summoned by his name, commotion outside the bank announced Whitmore's arrival in Millbrook. Through the window, they could see him dismounting from a hired carriage, accompanied by several well-dressed men who carried themselves with the arrogance of people accustomed to buying whatever they wanted. Speak of the devil, Fitzgerald muttered. Sarah May stood and walked to the window, studying the delegation with the calm assessment of someone who had survived their worst attacks. She returned to the table and wrote, "Time for final confrontation. Better to face them now from position of strength." Thomas nodded and gathered the bank documents. "Mr. Fitzgerald, please prepare the paperwork for those land acquisitions. We'll return this afternoon to finalize everything." They walked out of the bank just as Whitmore's group reached the sidewalk. The Eastern investor's face showed surprise and anger when he saw Thomas clearly. He had expected the cattle drive to fail and leave Sarah May vulnerable to renewed pressure. "Thomas Mitchell," Whitmore said, his voice carrying across the street. "I heard rumors you'd returned. I trust your ADVENTUR in Chicago was educational." "Very educational," Thomas replied evenly. "I learned that honest ranchers can compete successfully in any market when they're not sabotaged by unscrupulous competitors." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Sabotaged? That's a serious accusation." Sarah May stepped forward and pulled out her journal, writing quickly before showing the page. To Whitmore, "We know about the rustlers you hired. We know about the false livestock inspector. We know you're working with corrupt officials. Game is over." One of Whitmore's companions, a silver-haired man with dead eyes, studied Sarah May with interest. "You must be the famous mute wife I've heard so much about. Quite the little spitfire, aren't you?" The casual condescension was a mistake. Sarah May had endured a lifetime of people underestimating her because of her disability, and she was no longer the frightened girl who could be intimidated by Eastern arrogance. She wrote steadily in her journal, then showed the page to the entire group. "I am Sarah May Mitchell, co-owner of the largest cattle operation in Montana Territory. You will address me with respect or remove yourself from my presence." The silver-haired man laughed. "Largest cattle operation? My dear woman, you have perhaps 200 head of cattle on a few thousand acres. My employers control ranches in Texas with 50,000 head." Sarah May smiled and wrote again, "Your Texas ranches are not in Montana Territory. Here, we make the rules, and we've decided you're not welcome." Whitmore stepped forward, his patience clearly exhausted. "Enough games. Mitchell, my employers are prepared to offer you $50,000 for your entire operation. It's more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes of ranching." "Not interested," Thomas said flatly. "Think carefully," the silver-haired man warned. "Accidents happen to people who interfere with legitimate business interests. Your wife's little battle with those rustlers was fortunate. Next time, she might not be so lucky." The threat was clear and direct. Thomas felt his hand move toward his gun, but Sarah May touched his arm lightly. She was writing again, her pencil moving with calm precision across the page. When she finished, she handed the journal to Dr. Harrison, who had emerged from his office across the street upon hearing the commotion. The doctor read her words aloud. In a voice that carried to the growing crowd of townspeople, "The Mitchell Ranch hereby offers to purchase Marcus Whitmore's business interests in Montana Territory for $1. If refused, we will use our resources to ensure that Eastern investors who threaten territorial families are prosecuted to the full extent of federal law. The audacity of the counteroffer sent murmurs through the crowd. Sarah May had just publicly challenged the Eastern investors on their own terms, offering to buy them out rather than submit to their pressure. Whitmore's face flushed red. "You can't be serious. You're nobody, a broken-down widower and a mute girl playing at being ranchers." "Actually," interrupted a new voice, "they're the most successful ranchers in territorial history." Everyone turned to see Territorial Governor Samuel Crawford approaching with a small entourage of officials. The governor was a practical man who understood that economic development required protecting successful businesses from predatory practices. "Governor Crawford," Whitmore said, quickly composing himself, "how fortunate. Perhaps you can explain to these people the benefits of cooperating with established Eastern investment firms." Crawford studied Whitmore coldly. "Mr. Whitmore, I've received several disturbing reports about your activities in this territory. Intimidation of citizens, corruption of local officials, organization of armed attacks on legitimate businesses. These are federal crimes." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Whitmore said smoothly. Sarah May was already writing. She handed her journal to the governor, who read, "We have witnesses, documentation, and testimony from captured attackers, ready to press federal charges if necessary." Governor Crawford nodded approvingly. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've heard remarkable things about your operation. The territory needs more citizens like you and your husband, people who build rather than steal, who create prosperity rather than simply extract it." He turned to Whitmore and his associates. "Gentlemen, I strongly suggest you conclude your business in Montana Territory and seek opportunities elsewhere. Citizens who contribute to our economic development will always have the protection of territorial law." The dismissal was absolute. Whitmore and his people had lost not just their immediate scheme, but any hope of future operations in the territory. As they retreated to their carriage, Whitmore delivered one final threat. "This isn't over, Mitchell. My employers have long memories and substantial resources." Sarah May wrote one last response and handed it to Thomas, who read it aloud. Then, "Tell your employers they're welcome to try again. The Mitchell Ranch will be ready." 6 months later, the transformation of Copper Creek Valley was complete. The Mitchell Ranch had grown to encompass over 20,000 acres, running 3,000 head of prime cattle and employing dozens of workers from throughout the territory. Thomas and Sarah May had established the first systematic breeding program in Montana, implemented scientific range management techniques, and created a distribution network that reached markets from Chicago to San Francisco. More importantly, they had proven that frontier families could build empires that rivaled anything Eastern money could create, and they had done it through partnership, determination, and refusal to be intimidated by those who mistook their origins for weakness. A warm spring evening in 1889, exactly 2 years after Sarah May's arrival at the ranch, the Mitchell family sat on their expanded porch watching cattle graze in pastures that stretched to the horizon. Catherine, now walking confidently and beginning to speak her first words, played with wooden toys that Thomas carved in the evenings. Sarah May, no longer needing to hide her pregnancy, carried their second child, a son who would be born in the summer. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if your father had made a different choice that day?" Thomas asked, watching the sunset paint the valley gold. Sarah May considered the question, then wrote in her journal, "Father thought he was solving a problem by selling me. Instead, he gave me the chance to build something extraordinary. Sometimes the worst moments create the best opportunities." She paused, then added, "Besides, I wasn't really sold. I was invested. And we've proven to be the best investment Montana Territory ever made." Thomas laughed and pulled her closer. the lonely widowed rancher, and the pregnant mute girl who shocked the entire territory. Sarah May smiled and wrote one final entry: "Empire built on love is stronger than empire built on fear. Let that be our legacy." As the stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, the Mitchell Ranch settled into peaceful evening rhythms. But their story would be told for generations: how a desperate transaction became a true partnership, how two wounded people healed each other while building something that changed an entire territory, and how courage and determination proved stronger than money and intimidation. The empire they built would endure long after they were gone, but more importantly, it would stand as proof that the most powerful force in any territory was not money or violence, but the unshakable determination of people who refused to accept that their circumstances defined their destiny. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.